My name is David Clunie, and I'm the rector here at St. Bartholomew's Church in Ottawa. And I'm delighted to welcome the Irish Ambassador to Canada, Dr. Eamonn McKee. And Ambassador McKee is here because of the Irish window that's behind us, behind our altar at St. Bartholomew's. And this window, quite a famous window, actually known in the stained glass world, all over the world, as the Ottawa window, was created by Wilhelmina Geddes, an Irish artist who lived in Belfast but did her work in Dublin with the Tower of Glass movement. And this is over 100 years ago. This window was created from between 1916 and 1919. And the story of the window and the Irish connection is the reason that the ambassador is with me now. And so I'll welcome you here to St. Bartholomew's. And it was just a week or two ago that you got to see this window for the first time. How did it strike you?
Well, first of all, Canon, David, it's great to be here. I didn't know, like most Irish people, about this window. And it was thanks to Rob Nelson, my neighbour, and yourself, that I got to learn about it. And it is a masterpiece. So having talked about it, we were walking past, and actually your organist let us in. And when you come in here first, it really is stunning. I mean, I'd seen the photograph that Rob had sent me, Rob Nelson, and indeed yourself. And when you come in and you see it, particularly with the sun coming through it, it is an astonishing work of art. It is a genuine masterpiece. And I don't think I've ever seen a piece of stained glass art like that. And I think it is a masterpiece, and I want to thank you and indeed the parishioners over the last 100 years for looking after it so well. But I think the story of the window and how it came to be here is a fascinating one too. And the more I've read about it and the more that I've talked to you about it, the more that story deepens, you know. So it's a real pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in the presence of this window, I have to say.
Well, the story is really intrinsic to St. Bartholomew's. We are situated right next to the Governor General's residence, Rideau Hall, and this church has always been associated with the Governors General in Canada. Informally, they worshipped here, and in 1909, Prince Arthur, who was Queen Victoria's third son, he was named the Governor General of Canada. So he took up his residence in Rideau Hall, and his wife, the Duchess, and their daughter, Princess Patricia, who became quite famous, they lived there, they worshipped here, they loved this church, but the church was very, very plain. In fact, behind me, the window, where the window is now, is facing east, and when they first worshipped here, it was plain glass. And in fact, in the morning when the sun was out, it was so bright that you couldn't see anybody at the front of the church. So the Duchess, actually very practically minded, provided a curtain that went over the bottom of the window so people could see. The reason I mention that is that they understood both this church and some of the practical things about this window which comes into play. At any rate, when World War I was declared, the people who were the assistants of the Governor General were all veterans of the Boer War, and they formed the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. And the Princess Patricia gave her name to it, and in fact, she sewed the colors of the regiment. Those colors were blessed on the altar right behind us in 1914. And with great civic fanfare, the Princess Patricias were the first regiment to leave Canada and go to fight in World War I. In early 1915, two of the Governor General's closest confidants, who were the leaders of the Princess Patricias, were killed in action. And then subsequent to that, a number of others were, and he was devastated. Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught. In fact, he was overcome with grief. So he actually left Canada in 1916 and went back to England. But he wanted to do something to memorialize his friends, and he remembered this church, and the people who died had all gone to this church as well. And so he commissioned this window. Now, how did he come to commission it from an Irish woman?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what's going on. I think that's what's fascinating about this window. I mean, from the 1890s onwards, there's a recovery of the kind of Gaelic Irish traditions, and it leads to a renaissance in art and in drama. This is where W.W. Yeats comes out of this ferment. Part of it too is also the arts and crafts movement. There's a fascination with the medieval period, and of course the stained glass are medieval warriors from the 11th and 12th centuries. And the arts and crafts movement prompts famous Irish artist Sarah Purser to set up on Tuaird Loan a stained glass window studio in Pembroke Street in Dublin. And of course you can understand why. Stained glass is in demand for churches in Ireland, but also internationally. And she sees Ireland as playing this kind of leading role in stained glass art. Sarah Purser becomes familiar with Wilhelmina Geddes, who was, born in Leitrim, worked in Belfast, Dublin, and London. But Sarah Purser is aware that she's a fantastic Irish artist. She's a student in Belfast. So that's how the connection is made. I think the Governor General, as you were telling me, goes to Ireland through the Leslies of Castle Leslie, meets Sarah Purser and says, I have the perfect Irish artist for you to do this window. So Geddes does something incredibly bold with this in a way. As you said, she has to pick dark glass to shield it from the sun, which is difficult to work with. But she takes the arts and crafts movement, the fascination with the Middle Ages, and makes what is this fantastic window, all made in Pembroke Street in Dublin. And it's got a fantastically strong narrative. And I think the broader political context is also really interesting up until 1916, because the Irish Catholics in Canada who have settled into society here don't see any conflict with being Irish nationalist, Catholic and loyal to the Crown. It's just not an issue for them. And so the Irish Catholics join the Canadian Expeditionary Force in huge numbers. The other motivation, of course, for them is that they believe that Ireland should also enjoy home rule. The Canadians have had Confederation in 1867. One of the architects of Confederation was an Irishman, Thomas D'Arcy McKee. So they have found themselves an accommodation within the Commonwealth with the Crown as sovereign, and they've settled into society here. And in a way, when the call comes to serve king and country, that's what they do. So the Irish Catholics in Canada join essentially the Canadian forces to fight for king and country, but also for home rule in Ireland, because our parliament was abolished in 1800. So in a way, there's this great confluence, a convergence in Ireland, because the demand in Ireland is also for home rule. It's not a demand for separatism, it's a demand for the return of our parliament, led by John Redmond, who's the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. And John Redmond adopts exactly the same position as the Irish Canadians. He says, let's the Irish volunteers join the British Army, fight for Little Belgium, and prove that they're entitled to and deserve home rule. He also had an idea that the mere fact of fighting together in the First World War would bring the nationalist and unionist traditions together, so that we could avoid conflict when home rule is granted, because the unionists obviously in Ireland are resisting home rule. In fact, John Redmond comes to Canada in 1914 and he's met with enormous acclaim across Canada, particularly by Irish Canadians, because they feel he has delivered home rule. The British government have enacted home rule in 1912, postponed it for 2 years, and then of course the war postponed it again. So we're just on the edge of getting home rule. So the window comes out of this artistic and political confluence of forces in Ireland, and there's no real tension or divergence, So that's why it's really quite significant.
Well, one of the things about the window that is that it's, of course, about soldiers. Mm-hmm. It's about soldiers who died. And in fact, the title of the window, the working title, is "A Fallen Warrior is Received into the Company of Saints and Angels." And in the window, you see a fallen warrior right there on the left panel who has fallen. He's got his staff over his shoulder, and he's accompanied by 2 angels. And the other 6 figures in the middle and in the right of the window, those are all soldier saints or warrior saints, although 5 of them are men, and Joan of Arc is in there too. And they're receiving this fallen soldier into the company of heaven. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a plaque on the wall that's right behind you that has the names of 10 people commemorated in the window, just 10. And they were people that were known to the Governor General, and the window memorializes. Now, the window for us has become a war memorial window, which may not have been what he intended, but at the same time, I like the idea that, you know, you have to show your grief particularly in order to see it universally. I think something like that. So we take it as a memorial window for World War I. The big question, and the clergy who have preceded me in this parish were very mixed on whether this was a suitable window for a church.
Right. Yeah.
It's just far too militaristic, and it seems to be lauding soldiers and warriors. And perhaps there's some truth to that, but I think the key to the window for me, having it in a church, and this is where Geddes snuck this in, I believe. Clearly, she received a commission from Prince Arthur to memorialize, you know, his friends. Yet she was the daughter of a Methodist minister, and she had a Christian streak in her. And in the very center of the window, in a tiny little square, on the pennant of the first saint, who is Longinus, the saint who is at the foot of the cross, a Roman centurion, is Jesus on the cross. Both on the cross and risen. It's not just a crucifix. And it hides in plain sight. In truth of fact, that pane is about like this. And yet, look at that huge window, so you don't see it. So my take on the window and my justification for it being here, and I think it's a little Irish wit that's put in there, is that Geddes is saying, God is behind everything. Both the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross and the conquering of death by the resurrection is there behind everything, except we, the world, hardly see it at all. The pomp, the glamour, the noise of war obscures everything. And yet it's always there, and it's a witness behind the reality of this window. I think that's the spiritual context that Geddes brought to the window. Of course, she's trying to say that the sacrifice wasn't in vain. It meant something.
I think that's a really important point, because we have to go back to the kind of 1914 and the run into 1914. And at that time, soldiering and the kind of martial qualities were seen as admirable. They were seen as kind of romantic. And a lot of the motifs around going to war, saving little Belgium, were chivalrous. They were about knights and man asserting his kind of military prowess at a time when there's vast industrialization and so on. And this is this kind of the attraction to knightly valor is very obvious a reaction to that. And you know, the Western European countries all partook in that kind of view, and of course they thought the war would be over by Christmas. And in Ireland, you have the Ulster Volunteers who have mobilized to resist Home Rule, and you've got the National Volunteers who have taken their example and mobilized too. So you've got the men who are, you know, have day jobs, are at the weekend, they're buying their own uniforms, they're dressing up, they're creating officers, and they're marching around the place. I mean, it's quite strange from our position that this is what they're doing as a hobby, but they're actually arming themselves. So it's very easy for these guys to kind of say, oh, well, here's a chance for war and for honor and for glory, and they go off to battle thinking it's going to be quite short, and they'll come back heroes. And of course, it's not short. It turns into this horrible quagmire of mud and blood. But up until 1916, it's still just on the verge of being heroic. And this inspires a group of Irish Republican Brotherhood planners and militarists, in a way, to rebel. And they planned the rising in Dublin. Easter 1916, Pádraig Pearse, their leader, writes and speaks very eloquently about the need for Irish nationalists to assert their independence, to shed blood, to prove their kind of valor and the fact that they deserve a nation state. So in a way, that's the same motivation, but on behalf of Ireland. Right. The Ulster Volunteers join, and they go through the same process, but on the battlefields of Europe at the Somme. And so for the Ulster Unionists who fight in the Somme, that becomes, in a way, their claim to autonomy, which eventually becomes Northern Ireland. So 1916 then fundamentally changes everything, because when the leaders are therefore executed afterwards, kind of day by day under martial law, political opinion on Ireland fundamentally shifts. The Irish Parliamentary Party is wiped out in the 1918 election and replaced by Sinn Féin. The demand is for separatism, for a republic separate from the Commonwealth, separate from the Crown. We want a republic. And this shift, the population basically joins with this shift. John Redmond's party is suddenly irrelevant. And you have this divergence between the Irish Canadians and the Irish nationalist movement at home. And so when the War for Independence begins, what you have is that the mood and the ambition of Irish nationalists in Ireland is actually aligned with Irish Americans. And there's this break with the view of the Irish Canadians. And I think that's the real split. I mean, Yeats said, about 1916, a terrible beauty is born. And that's what he's talking about, the kind of the purity of an Irish nationalist identity, saying we want complete separation, we are Republicans, this is what we are fighting and dying for. And so you have this divergence between the Irish in Canada and the Irish at home. And that's a fascinating process. And it really underlines the fact that 1916 was, to a large extent, it was within its own terms a successful rebellion. This is the first time since the Normans took Dublin in 1170 that Dublin has been wrested back from Britain and so on. But ultimately is the execution of the leaders that fundamentally changes the political demands. And in a way, where the Irish-Canadian political settlement had been the kind of paragon, the thing to which we were aspiring, it isn't anymore,
Well, the whole aftermath of World War I changed the world. It traumatized our country. 66,000 Canadians died in that war. And it was 1919 when this window was unveiled, okay? And it was in all the things you're talking about. People were trying to make sense of the war. And of course, a lot of it didn't make sense, the numbers that died. The window was unveiled by the Prince of Wales, who was in Ottawa to unveil the Peace Tower, which is the center block of our Parliament, Peace Tower. And he came here, of course he was staying next door at Rideau Hall, he came and unveiled this window. And there's an account in the local newspaper that a gasp went up from the congregation because no one had ever seen anything like it. It's so striking. I mean, there are no other Geddes windows in Canada or United States. But lots in Dublin and in England, and a couple on the continent, especially in Ypres Cathedral.
So this is the only one, I think, outside of Europe.
That's right. That's right. And so it was so important, but it was so strong. This window could never have been created by a committee.
Right.
It had its own strength, and only royal fiat could have done it, and that's exactly what happened.
And an artist's vision.
An artist's vision, and the two going together. People had to ask the question, why did it all happen? And there's another small link to all this. I think many people know the hymn, the patriotic hymn, I vow to thee my country. Now, it's got a line in it that says, the love that asks no questions. And that has put it out of favor in these days. You'll not find that hymn in Canadian hymnals because of that line. And yet the man who wrote those lines, Cecil Spring Rice, had been the British ambassador to Washington and had got the Americans into World War I. and then came to Ottawa, lived at Rideau Hall, and died there, and composed the words. And he said, I need to put some meaning in it. People gave their lives for what they believed in. They didn't ask questions of their country. That has to be honored. We today ask questions of our country, but we have to understand that at the time, that's what was needed.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, this is trivia, but Cecil Spring Rice was buried from this church. You
Right.
know, the man who wrote those lines.
Right. Yeah, and it's really interesting because so many Irish national volunteers listened to John Redmond, joined the British Army, and we were talking well over 200,000, 240,000. Possibly a quarter of them died. And yet the Ireland that the Irish and the British Army came back to really didn't have a place for them in the narrative. They were displaced by the rebels of 1916. In contrast, the Irish Catholics who had joined the Canadian forces, the Irish Canadians, came back heroes. And so there again, that kind of illustrates the depth of how the political paradigm has shifted in Ireland at this time. And of course, and you know better than I, that involvement in the war is very formative for Canadian identity, but also for the proud place that the Irish Catholics took as citizens of Canada. It becomes a really important point for them. I think you also told me that this window was one of the first commemorations, whereas, for example, the fabulous monument at Vimy, I mean, these take most of the monuments they come much later. You know.
That's right. It seems that around the country we were in such shock after the war. It took a few years to get cenotaphs built in various towns. We have a plaque of honor here in the church that has 16 names of people who died in World War I, and yet that plaque wasn't erected till 1927.
Yeah.
It's the kind of grip that everybody was in. A trauma, really. PTSD is for the whole country.
Sure.
Is what happened.
Yeah.
And making sense of it all, and the window stood as a kind of testament to that, but it's been controversial ever since, and so. It's 100 years old, 102 years old, needs some work. And that's actually why we began. We're doing a documentary on the whole story of the window from St. Bart's, but it needs probably $250,000 worth of work. So we're working on raising the funds to that. I'm sure we're going to do that. But so it'll be here for the next 100 years.
Yeah. No, when my wife and I came to see it, when you stand up close, you can see it buckling and so on. Of course, the winters in Canada are particularly ferocious, so it's probably it's been vulnerable. And in terms of the fundraising, I want to wish you well. I have been in touch with headquarters, and it's my honour on behalf of the Irish government to make a contribution to that fundraising. We collected some money from a number of different funds, and that's our contribution to your fund. Yes, it's 40,000 Canadian.
40,000 Canadian dollars. So I'm overwhelmed. That's wonderful.
Great.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, it's such a masterpiece. It tells such a great story.
Yeah.
The Irish government is really happy to be able to make this contribution and get your fundraising off to a good start.
Well, thank you. And on behalf of everyone here, we thank you and the government of Ireland and the Irish Embassy in Ottawa, and especially. And it's a great pleasure to learn so much about that. Eamonn, have come to Canada and are telling us things about our Irish brothers and sisters that we didn't know, and that's really a great gift too.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and it's an honor, it's a privilege, and it's a thrill to understand, and be introduced to the great story of the Irish in Canada. Through my background, I had served in Washington. I married an Irish Italian, was involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland for a long time, and I was very intimately aware of the Irish American kind of identity and so on. And so being able to come here is a real privilege to try to understand the Irish Canadian experience, which is very, very different from the Irish American one. Not a story that's well known in Canada in many ways, because the Irish contribution to Canada is enormous from the communities they established, their involvement in politics. Thomas D'Arcy McKee, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is based on the Royal Irish Constabulary. The Catholic education curriculum, so many Irish involved in agriculture and business and so on. So we want to tell that story because the Irish in Canada engage in a fascinating process of the construction, not just of communities, but identities. And of course, we don't really know this story in Ireland either. So yeah, we're putting it out on social media as kind of hashtag Irish in Canada, collecting the stories and wanting to tell this story. I would also like to say as well, of course, some of your parishioners here have made contributions to the Northern Ireland peace process. Judge Corey came to Northern Ireland to investigate a number of cases of lethal force and collusion. He was a parishioner here. I worked closely with him. He made a fantastic contribution. And one of your current parishioners here, General John de Chastelain, of course, who made a major contribution in the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons. And I was very pleased and honoured to meet him here last Sunday at the Remembrance service. So Canada and Canadians have played a huge role in the Northern Ireland peace process. And I think, you know, skipping forward, if 1916 created something of a divergence, I think that we've seen a great convergence in Ireland around notions of identity and the diversity of Irish identity. And you could see this even when I joined the department beginning in about 1980, feels maybe like 1890, but anyway, 1990, that we began to organise remembrance services for Irish people who were involved in foreign armed service, the British Army and so on. And the peace process was a huge boost to this recovery of the many strands of Irish identity. When Queen Elizabeth II visited Ireland in March of 2011, it was a real moment of historic rapprochement, because up until then we'd had this problem with the Crown, partition, Northern Ireland, and it was a wonderful visit that she carried out tremendously well with real sensitivity and deftness. Our President, Michael T. Higgins, of course, went on a return visit in 2014 on an official visit to Britain. And in a way, that's the kind of the fruits of the Irish peace process, is this rapprochement, is this sense of the many varieties of Irish identity. And in that kind of way, you know, Canada is a really interesting study as well of how you can run a country on the basis of multiple diversities, all proudly asserting themselves, yet all bound by the values of being Canadian. You know, so if we've gone from the confluence of influences that gave rise to this wonderful window, the kind of divergence through the struggle for independence, and now I think we're seeing a real convergence around, again, these kind of values of diversity. You know, so for all of those reasons, this window is really important, and it's great to be able to have this time to discuss it with you and to make our own contribution to the restoration and preservation of this Irish masterpiece.
Well, again, thank you for that, and thank you for your interest in linking us to broader, you know, Irish identity things. You know, so much of our congregation draws Irish heritage. I'm half Irish and half Scottish, and that's just the way it goes in Canada. Of course, we're much more broad and diverse now, and that's all to the good too. But this is the foundation, and unearthing that is so important to who we are as a country. So I thank you for doing that. And you've only been here a year.
Yeah. Well, a lot more to discover. It's a big place, and yeah, plenty of treasures to uncover as well.
Indeed.
I'm sure.
Well,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Canon David. That was a pleasure.